But in VR, players will linger in a place. They'll observe every little detail, every little bit of that level from every possible angle. They'll mess with every little thing. Warpfrog's kind of philosophy on VR design was not to go wide, but to go deep. The player was shocked to find out that he could imbue each side of the blade different. I think PCVR players have much higher expectations. They're kind of expecting a bigger AAA type experience, more so than Quest players anyway. Studios aren't going to do it because they're too scared to risk it. They're going to need indie developers to kind of prove things first. The thing about PCVR development and VR development in general is it's the Wild West. You know, especially like when we were starting, it was the early days of VR, and there was no rules. There was no rule book. It's like if you're developing a flat game, you know, you can design environments and players will race through those environments in seconds. But in VR, players will linger in a place. They'll observe every little detail, every little bit of that level from every possible angle. They'll mess with every little thing. You know, if you have a table and it's full of clutter, in a flat game, you don't even think about it. In a VR game, the instinctive reaction from a player is to try and mess with it. So different. There's so much more depth to it. And the same thing, like on a flat game, you know, you swing your sword, you press left click, no problem. But in VR, it's like a player can move the sword in any number of ways to create all new kinds of design challenges you weren't prepared for. So that was the biggest thing, you know, it was just figuring this stuff out as we went and trying to kind of not think about game design like a flat game. Think about game design as a VR game, which no one was an expert on. With Blade Sorcery, Cosby is the original creator of Blade Sorcery, and back when he first came up with it, he wanted a game where he was going all in on physics simulation because that was something that was completely missing from VR. Just didn't exist. Because this was back in like 2017, 2018, mind you. So there was nothing like this in VR at the time. And so when Blade Sorcery came along, it's really a simulation game disguised as an action game, you know? And when those physics and that kind of tactile feedback you got from weapons was applied to melee, there was the magic of the game. That this is what the game was offering. It was new innovation that players hadn't seen before, felt before, because the majority of melee games at the time were these wiggle sword games, as I call them. You know, where the sword is weightless and floaty, and even though there was the very small few games that weren't like that, none of them were full physics simulations. So Blade Sorcery was really a pioneer when it came to that. And what's kind of interesting too is after Blade Sorcery, that was kind of the death of the wiggle sword genre of games. Like, you just don't see those games anymore. And I think that's a real testament. It kind of shows you like VR players wanted something else. So I feel like Blade Sorcery was kind of like the right innovation at the right time. And that's kind of, you know, how it all came to be. Warpfrog's kind of philosophy on VR design was not to go wide, but to go deep. And so when I was talking about, you know, find that core, what is the heart of your game? What is the new innovation you're bringing? Whatever that is, hinge on it hard. And so it's kind of like if we had a feature in our game, we're going to be a physics simulator. So it's like if we were to add a new feature, let's say we were going to add fishing or something like that. It's like, okay, we're going to have a physics simulator now that's fishing in our game. But not just that, but it's like, well, can I spearfish the fish? What about when I take the fish out of the water? Can I eat it? What about if I put the fish over fire? Will it cook? You know? And so it's like we go deep. So it was just one idea there, the ability to let the player fish. But now, because of the physics simulation aspect, because we're hinging hard on our core, the heart of our game, now we're going to go really deep with that. And like, it's real cool because, you know, players at a glance, you might look over a game like Blade Sorcery because you might think like, what exactly can I do? But that's kind of the point. If you keep pushing and you keep digging, you'll find you can do a crazy amount of small stuff and things have crazy synergies. Like there was there was a little video I saw recently of we have this spearing game with 2 blades on each end, and the player was shocked to find out that he could imbue each side of the blade differently. And then when he cast this special kind of gravity, this special kind of spell sapping, that like both the different imbues from both ends would fire at the same time. And it's just, that's kind of the beauty of it. You never really know where's the edge of the game. So that would be how I would think about it, is that don't think about VR development like Grand Theft Auto, even though we would all love Grand Theft Auto in VR. But if you're an indie studio, you got to be realistic about it. So don't try to go too broad with your game. Just find what you're really good at, find what's your innovation, and then just do that one thing really, really well. For an indie studio, PCVR development is undoubtedly harder than standalone because the market is just smaller and the expectations tend to be higher. I think to stand out, I think the most important thing is set realistic expectations as an indie studio with your audience. So if you're an indie, your game's going to be small compared to a AAA. And so you need to kind of figure out what is like the heart of your game. So don't try to do too much and ask yourself, like, what is the core innovation I'm bringing? And then do that thing very well and hinge on that thing. And if you don't have a core innovation, you should get one, because it's like, otherwise it's going to be hard to rally a community. If there's nothing exciting, there's no exciting orbit point for that community. And so for Blade and Sorcery, ours was physics simulation. That was like the heart of our game. Well, when we're developing Blade Sorcery, we're always thinking about the user experience. We're always thinking, what will the player do? What would be fun for the player to discover, and so forth and so on. You always have considerations, of course, like you're always thinking about performance, which we're always, pushing the hell out of because physics simulation is very CPU heavy. So that's a constant battle for us. But you're always thinking about that kind of thing. And like a nice kind of tool for indie developers is, you could lean on things like asset store and stuff like that. And that's great because it just saves you an absolute ton of time. But you have other considerations then, such as how performance friendly are those assets and how good are they? And is there a kind of thematic, homogeny and kind of in all the graphics you're using, all the assets you're using, is it thematically unified and stuff like that? But that's one way of doing it. And that's actually how we started off with Blade and Sorcery, was leaning into the asset store. And it was only when we grew bigger, around update 8, and we started adding more staff, and we had the people to make models and hand make environments and stuff like that. And that's when we decided, okay, we're going to try and make as kind of unified a vision now as possible. So we want to start making custom assets, and we're also going to try and make them as performance friendly as possible. If you're a small indie developer too, I think another thing you really need is good community engagement and good community management. I feel like if you're an indie, you don't have the luxury of marketing. You don't have that luxury of spending hundreds of thousands, of dollars on ads and things like that. And so the way that we did it at Warpfrog was like we were really, really, really all in from day one on community building. And I think when you're doing that, my advice there would be, again, I'm a little bit like a broken record, but again, to say, hinge on what your the heart of your studio, the heart of your game is. What is that core? Hinge on that. And then the second thing I would say is just don't BS your audience. I think people are sick of that. I think people are sick of marketing language and over-promising and stuff like that. I think be honest about it. We always had a policy here at Warpfrog from day one. I call it the warts and all policy, which is that, like, if you've got issues, it's like, yeah, like, no one's perfect. Like, point out the issues. Like, yeah, these are the issues. We're working on it. We're trying our best, But if you overpromise something and then you under deliver it, it's like people remember that stuff and it stings, and you're not going to be able to, you're going to get some short-term gain, but you're not going to have the support of a community behind you for the long haul. And I think that hurts. So I would say focus on your community if you're an indie game, and focus on the heart of whatever it is you do. And also, I would say, I wholly recommend to get yourself a community manager, because as I have a ton of respect for developers who try to do it all on their own, like they're the lead developer of a game and they do community. I have no idea how they do that. But if you get a community manager, it's great to have someone just focus on that. But the one thing I would say is don't pack your moderation team or your community management team with kind of like bulldogs, like people who are there to protect the developer and shield the developer. That's not so great, because then you just have this kind of guy who's buffering criticism and stuff like that, and that doesn't really feel like a community to me. That just feels like a line of defense. I think what you really want is the community manager to be the voice in between the studio and the community, and equally as invested in the studio as they are the community. And I think that's the best balance. And so, you see that in flat games too. I think sometimes flat game communities, they miss that mark too, and they get moderation teams that are overly protective, and I think in that some communication is lost. Yeah, the PC VR market, it's hard, man, because it's like at the moment the market is so small compared to standalone, and indie studios they're just having a hard time surviving, and I think that's why you're seeing so many games move to Quest. And then I think there's a kind of a feedback loop, because developers are leaning on Quest or they're Questifying their PC VR games because they have to. It's either that or die, so they're Questifying their games. And then that's kind of leading to like a negative feedback from PC VR players. So there's just this cycle going on. And then, I think you compound that then with the, I think PC VR players have much higher expectations. They're kind of expecting a bigger AAA type experience, more so than Quest players anyway. And I think that's just because they're coming from the world of, flat PC games where the ceiling is much higher and they just have better specs. So they're just used to better looking games, bigger games. But therein lies the dilemma, because it's like an indie game they just can't make, Grand Theft Auto or whatever, on PC VR, or Skyrim, like a game like that. And I mean, even look, the makers of Skyrim did make Skyrim VR, and even then they missed some steps, So it's like you need the indie developer to push innovation, because the big studios aren't going to do it because they're too scared to risk it. They're going to need indie developers to kind of prove things first. But if people don't support indie developers, then that's the end. You're not going to, the roads won't lead to AAA development for PC VR. So I'd say, I mean, we're all in. I absolutely love PC VR myself. It's just visually, you can just do so much more with it. The modding is so much easier for PC VR. So I love it. And Warpfrog are all in on it. I would just say to PC VR players, just like hold tight. I think it's getting there, but the first step is like, just adding more people aware of VR. And then I think PC VR's day will come eventually. These small indie studios will eventually become medium or big studios. And then even people like Warpfrog. And then we can be those guys who push the big games on PC VR. To help PC VR, I mean, I wish I had all the answers, but all I can say is just kind of from my perspective, from being in this industry now the past 5 years, and I'm very engaged, in the VR community and stuff. All I can say is I think things will happen with time, and in the meantime, just support indie developers, and be as positive and kind as you can, because it can be really demoralizing too to work on PC VR, because it's hard. And then at the end of the day, there's very possibly not going to be the payday that there would be with a standalone headset. And if you're an indie studio, like that's brutal, So then if you have that combined with people trashing you it can be really, really demoralizing. And I think that'll just turn developers away from PCVR. So I just say keep it all positive. PCVR developers are trying their absolute best. It's really, really hard, and it's really, really tempting to want to go to standalone. So I would just say give them as much cheerleading as you can, and support games on PCVR.